Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing tales of terror and hauntings in the Northern Ozarks. We will get back to that in a minute, but first we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, or about any other podcast platform. So what's so spooky in the Northern Ozarks?
From the bloodiest 47 acres in America to the true story behind the blues classic Stagger Lee and hauntings from prisons and more, the Jefferson City, Columbia, Missouri area has a number of crucial entries in the Dark Ozarks universe.
We will return to the Northern Ozarks in a minute, but first we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics that are too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-time copy of the book Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered into that drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
The Northern Ozarks, surprisingly filled with a lot of noir history that everyday America has a tendency to overlook, with the possible exception of one big location in Jefferson City.
One very, very big location, big buildings. The Missouri State Penitentiary, the old penitentiary. Also referred to as the walls. And if you've ever been by it, you understand why they say that, because it's as if you are going by the walls of a castle or a very big fort, which is not necessarily unintended.
No, it was definitely designed to be an unbelievably imposing structure.
It was. And when it was built in the 1830s, the capital, the Jefferson City, the second capital, was basically just being established. And although the area was settled earlier than a lot of other places in the state, it was still very rough country. And the facility was intended to be a dual use as a fort as well as a prison as needed.
I think that the average person, perhaps driving by the penitentiary in, say, the last 20 years, etc., first of all, likely had or has no idea how old the original portions of the penitentiary are, because we're dating back, Dave. The penitentiary opening in 1836.
Yes, actually, it opened on the day of the Alamo, the Battle of the Alamo.
A very interesting synchronicity, I suppose, in American history. And there's, of course, thousands of inmates in all of these years. A number of very evocative, infamous criminals were housed there for a variety of reasons. And we're going to talk about some of those tonight. It's exciting to pick that apart, put it back together. But something that to me is striking, first of all, is wrapping our heads around, just as you previously mentioned, how wild and untamed Missouri was in 1836. And the idea that as the penitentiary is being built, we don't have a lot of classic fortresses in the United States. And it seems that, the ones that there are a handful. My two favorites growing up was Fort Massachusetts on Ship Island. It was a Union fort and a prisoner of war camp on a barrier island off the coast of Mississippi during the Civil War, 11 miles off the coast. Incredible beaches, by the way. And of course, Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine. And I growing as a child, I loved both of them so much because you could engage, you could interact with the spaces. You could find the cannon, you could run to the through the spaces and up the staircases and so on and so forth. Just a neat experience all the way around. Fort Sumter was disappointing to me because there's like nothing left of it generally, as a result of it being a fort that was a target. So there is that. I remember looking out in Charleston Bay and being like expecting to see a fort, and it's not really there.
Not anymore, no.
There's a reason for that. But certainly out here on the, as the United States expanded westward, the forts were largely stockades. And by the time that resources or material was available to have built a substantial fortress, typically there was no longer a need for a substantial fortress.
True.
And so as a result of that, the penitentiary at Jeff City really stands uniquely as this imposing Gothic structure that isn't just for show. It wasn't just built as an example, and I love the building. I'm not dismissing the building whatsoever, but the early 20th century Pythian Castle in Springfield, which I love the Pythian Castle. It looks like a Georgian fortress, but it was never built to be a functional fortress.
True. Whereas the penitentiary is built that way.
Yes. And I think that it is phenomenal. The bits and pieces, the moments of it, not only its history, but various aspects of regional history that involve prison labor is a bit chilling, to be fair. And along with that, I also find just the architectural choices, the structure itself, the statements being made. In so many cases, particularly today, establishment of government is designed, at least with the patina of friendliness, openness, the PR marketing campaign to say, let's get together and hug in a very beige space, hopefully with lots of windows and sunlit regions and opening and closing doors that are won't shut and not let you out. And the penitentiary, you don't even have to know anything about the space. You could just have casually driven by with no knowledge of its history to know that this building was making a hell of a statement, and the statement was, we're in charge.
Exactly. And really the comparison on so many of those levels, to me, the best comparison really is Alcatraz, as far as construction, as far as that statement that we're in control, you are not. And having been to Alcatraz, it's, of course, after it was not being used, but going on tour, very much the same feeling. And when you go to Alcatraz, of course, you take the ferry over, so you have time to think about it as you approach and everything. Although with Penitentiary in Jeff City, it's almost the same feeling, because you see it for for a distance, and the way it's perched, that you have time to contemplate. And I'm sure that they did even in 1836 with the first prisoners, which started out with one prisoner to begin with, and then 15 more from St. Louis were the initial prisoners.
Yeah.
The first prisoner coming from Greene County, Missouri, from Springfield, for stealing a watch. And most of the other early prisoners were there for theft as well.
And once that started, it really didn't quit.
No.
The roll calls of prisoners, both infamous to history and mostly lost to history, passed through those walls or in and never left.
Yeah.
Now,
and perhaps still there.
And perhaps still there. I do want to add in, I'm a little jealous. I do want to see Alcatraz. I've never been. I'm really anxious to go out there and see it before the 22nd century, when a Federation dreadnought crashes into the top of it and destroys it, in at least one timeline of Star Trek. But fortunately, I'm assuming that in the 22nd century, the Jefferson City, the Missouri State Penitentiary at Jefferson City is still there. I just so people know, I have a bad habit of calling it the Jeff City Penitentiary, or the Penitentiary at Jeff City, and so I'm not used to calling it by its official name of the Missouri State Penitentiary, former Missouri State Penitentiary. That said, we talked about, well, there's a number of key criminals and key criminal cases, and capital punishment was done at the penitentiary.
Yes, beginning first with hangings, and then in the 50s they added the gas chamber.
And as a separate building, actually.
Yes.
And
that way they had to make the walk.
Yes. And there is what's called the hole, that is essentially a dungeon. And the penitentiary was in use all the way up until it closed in comparatively recent times, 2004.
Yeah, and then it wasn't too much longer after that, 4 or 5 years, that they started doing walkthrough tours, generally with former employees conducting them, as a means of preserving the buildings. And then those have gotten to the point that they're daily. You have to make reservations. There are, daily public ghost tours as well. Plus, you can book private investigations as well. The private investigations I know are booked out almost a year in advance. So it's continuing to attract people. And I think it's good because I think a lot of people do end up going on the tours because they're interested in the hauntings, but there's a lot of history to see and learn about. And so it's one more example of where interest in the paranormal, I think, helps give a good context to our history.
I would very much agree with that. And that's something that we see pretty consistently at this point. And I think it's important to interject. I continually find it fascinating. We've transitioned in a fairly short time, I'd say about 20 years, from hauntings in public spaces falling under the category of the employees being told, don't mention any of the weird things that happen here because it might hurt business, to
Right.
Actively promoting the weird things that happen in the locations because it's good for business. And I think by and large, that's very positive.
It really is. And more tourism is gaining traction, and it is a good thing all across the country, not just the Ozarks. So
yeah. So I found this particular number interesting. In 1932, the 47 acres had approximately 5,300 inmates. This is they were packed in for obvious.
Yeah, it was not designed for that many. And some of the cells, particularly in isolation cells, the dungeon, some of those cells, they packed up to, 10, 12 people in there in a cell.
Right. And of course, there was, over its long history, a considerable amount of prisoner abuse that took place. A lot of prisoners, for a variety of reasons, and some just because they were serving out such long sentences, a lot of individuals died within this space.
Yes, a lot died from illness, from violence. Discipline was very harsh, particularly in the earlier days, but really up through a lot of the 20th century as well. Guards could physically discipline prisoners for pretty much any infraction.
Mm-hmm.
And being put in isolation was not uncommon. And some of these cells were so dark. In fact, they were, there's one that's called the blind cell, that if someone was in there over a couple of weeks, often they would lose their eyesight because there was absolutely no light. And even an instance of a female prisoner being put in there who died shortly after coming out after a month.
And which also brings up an interesting fact: there were both male and female inmates in.
Yes, women were added later, but yes, but still, it was in the 1800s when they started housing female prisoners there too.
Right. In 1868, the A Hall was built to house post-Civil War criminals.
Yes, and I guess we should note that during the Civil War, when it was a prisoner of war camp, the conditions were known to get pretty deplorable. Regular Army prisoners, Confederate prisoners, were housed there. Most of the Parson Rangers or bushwhackers, irregular Confederates, were sent to St. Louis to the Garrett Street prison. But Some were sent to Jeff City as well as some female Confederate prisoners.
Right. It's and then so the penitentiary did operate a lease program where businessmen could hire inmates to work for them, and several buildings in Jefferson City, including the first Capitol, the governor's mansion, which we'll talk about later in the episode, and several area homes were built using prison labor, or essentially slave labor.
Right, which during the time period was not an unusual practice throughout the country.
No, it was not. And I think the prevailing view, I find the dynamics of this process to be really fascinating, because the prevailing view, of course, from a law and order perspective, is you threaten society by your actions. You did so of your own accord. Nobody was twisting your arm and taking the extremely hierarchical pro on the outside pro societal law and order position here for just a moment. Nobody made you go commit those crimes. So at the point that you chose to do that and chose to put yourself beyond the pale, then it's up for grabs. You basically forfeited your soul at that point.
Pretty much in a civic sense, yes.
And certainly I think throughout this entire process, it's very easy to constantly be swinging back and forth between these extremes in terms of, for example, the deplorable conditions, our difficulty perhaps of wrapping our heads around essentially slave labor, prison labor camp, prison labor, the treatment of prisoners at various times throughout this process. But then you flip over to some of the inmates, some of the crimes that were committed, some of the atrocities that these individuals chose. Bonnie B. Hetty is one. Premeditated murder of a 6-year-old for money. And
Bonnie Hetty and Carl Hall. It's a very gruesome case.
And then you look at that, and it doesn't take too many newspaper articles in earlier times, whipping up the sentiment that you're going, y'all just deserve what you got. Go behind the walls and rot for all the rest of us care. We're going to go on with our lives. It's very, it really messes with your perceptions to deal with the structures like this, because, and I think it's also fair, there is a morbid fascination with these structures, but there is also, it's much easier to be fascinated about it in the past tense and not even think about it in the present tense. We don't even want to wrap our heads around the fact that, even to the point that we create these euphemisms for them today, like the very touchy-feely sound of the term correctional center.
Instead of prison or penitentiary.
It's but it does come down. I think we ought to talk a little about just some of the reported hauntings. Well, before we do that, we really should talk about the September 1954 riot.
And it was not isolated. There had been a number of prison riots across the country, coming out of very harsh conditions of the facilities, and poor treatment. And basically, wind got to some of the prisoners that there had been riots going on, and that's kind of what started whipping up the sentiment. And it started with a couple of prisoners feigning illness, guards coming in to check on them, and basically they jumped them. They bludgeon one to death immediately, get their keys, and start opening cell doors.
Right. And that was, of course, the evening of September 22nd. By midnight, Missouri Highway Patrol, police from Kansas City and St. Louis, and the National Guard were at the prison responding. By that time, 4 buildings were on fire. And before it was over, nearly 2,500 inmates were loose and rioting on the inside of the walls.
Yes. They killed some of the other inmates. One inmate, I think, committed suicide or tried to in the midst of all this, and just a lot of damage. And so now law enforcement was faced with the fact that they were having to assault a fortress, basically.
Yes, the situation. I mean, the building the complex that had been designed to be not only impenetrable but also impossible to get out of, now was having to be the structures that they were having to go into. That and you add on to this from the very beginning, the penitentiary is not far removed or somehow isolated from the neighborhoods of Jefferson City.
No, it's not like you have a barrier area between at all. And so they basically had lines of defenses, and it came down to 18 officers going in, heavily armed, and really not knowing what they were going to find.
Right. And it was, I mean, I think for a short period of time, that was basically a war zone.
Mm-hmm.
And in all fairness to the gravity of the situation, a war zone that if that riot and those inmates had not been contained, they would have had somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 extremely dangerous individuals loose in the Capitol.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's why they had 2 more fallback lines with armed officers. It was basically a military style campaign to take control, and it took a number of hours to get control.
It was, and surprisingly, comparatively speaking, considering the intensity and the expansiveness of the 1954 riot, a surprisingly low casualty count on both sides.
Yes, I mean, it is pretty surprising that there wasn't more death or severe injuries, which in part may be that a lot of the people participating, it was opportunistic, and also a sense of frustration over conditions itself, and not more calculated.
And I need to read more on it, but it may also speak to the effectiveness of the response. And
I think that was in part, yes.
The response that realistically, just in terms of numbers, may have been a lot more humane than we would think, or that we would initially conclude.
That's true. They had officers on the roofs, and they warned everyone to get in cells, or they would be shot. Only one refused and he was shot. And then basically once that happened, everyone pretty much cooperated.
And the inmates who had been rioting were processed, and everyone was back in their cells by mid-afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, that's amazing. When you're dealing with that many and trying to get them all to the right spot again.
Yeah. And the term bloodiest 47 acres in America was coined by Time magazine in 1967. The damage caused by the riot was estimated at $5 million, and that's $5 million in 1954 dollars, not 2023 dollars. So it does give an idea of the scope. But 168 years of operation, and throughout the history, again giving a sense of scope. The penitentiary contained as many as 50 buildings within those 47 acres. So it's massive, and with, again, that incredible history. Now, what are your, before we get into the individual cases, your cursory thoughts just on the hauntings of a location like this?
Well, I think a couple of things come into play. One, you have so many people going through there, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands over the years of prisoners, of employees. You have a lot of tension, high emotions, whether it be fear, whether it be anger, depression, etc. That it may seem cliche, but those kinds of things do seem to permeate an environment, and you end up with that type of atmosphere almost sealed in the walls. And for a lot of these prisoners, I mean, even ones that are, say, on work release or something, so much of their time is just rumination and, stuck in your head thinking about everything, that I think it really does have an impact. Then you have a lot of violence. You have people who died, whether by the public hanging, not public, but the hangings, or later the gas chamber, other violence. There's the example of the prisoner who was known to be a snitch, that he was beaten to death. And he's specifically, his cell is a area that people encounter paranormal activity on a regular basis, and they think it's him. So you have a lot of the factors that go into a haunting in various locations, all in one spot.
Yes.
And so, if it weren't haunted, I would be amazed.
Agreed. And a handful of locations, and the penitentiary is one of those locations, that I would contend that all the normal things that we say about hauntings go out the window.
Very true. Maybe some of course the more typical things, but you're just going to have a lot more chance to have something that is angry, that is interactive, that is really trying to push back, because of what was experienced there.
And and I suppose I should clarify, because much of our work is not done in these locations. It's done in mostly positive settings. It's done in everyday settings, and something that, in all fairness, the plethora of ghost shows and their resident requisites of the medium, almost said Resident Evil, Raccoon City forever, is is associated with, has created certainly a lot of interest in the paranormal, a lot of mystique about the paranormal, but it has also created a lot of fear. And I had the opportunity to give one couple a tour at the Old English Inn within, fairly recently, and they were the wife in particular, she wanted to go on the tour. She wanted to see the hotel. She wanted to know about the history. She was interested in the ghosts. It was also obvious that she was a little bit scared. And before we did anything else on the mezzanine, I'm like, okay, here, time out. Here is how we need to approach this. We need to understand that these are residents. They are here because they care about the location. They have an emotional or some sort of energetic bond to this space. We're the guests, and we need to treat this space with a great deal of calm and respect, and just let them know that we love the space too. We appreciate it. It's all going to be fine. There's nothing really to be creeped out about. There's nothing really to be concerned about. We see the same thing at the Kendrick House. We see the same thing at the Ritchie Mansion. We see the same thing. The Webb City Library last November. And again, great attendees, great crowd, great questions. But a lot of the cursory comments was, oh my gosh, it's spooky. Oh, what can ghosts do to us? These types of things. And we're like, it's a library, guys. Calm down.
Yeah.
Calm down. If somebody is here, and they're here because they love the space too, it's okay. Now we get to the 47 Bloodiest Acres of America. This is a little different.
Yeah. I mean, it's, they are the residents. We are the guests there. But their attachment is not there because they are there because they have warm and friendly feelings about it. And they do, in those situations, they tend to lash out more. Now, I have seen some of the same behavior happen other places, that you wouldn't put in that same category. One of the hauntings that occurs there, is related as sometimes, feeling something going through them, and, the feeling of being pushed, etc. I've seen that happen in other locations that you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, it's a prison or it's an asylum or it's this or that would lend itself to anger. So those things can happen in other locations, but generally not. And it generally has a lot more to do with the atmosphere of the living too, right. But
and I would say that the energy that you take with you into a space like penitentiary is even more important to police yourself and your energy within that space. It's important on any investigation, but it's especially important in a space like this.
Yes, because you do need to be on guard. One location that that you've been to as well would be the Bordello in Galena, Kansas. That there's someone there that's not happy, and you know they will take advantage of that if they can, and that's what happens in these types of situations in the penitentiary, is just that amplified.
Yes. And we should note, I have not been in the penitentiary since it has been open for these tours. I do very much want to go. I've talked to several people who have been.
Mhm.
I definitely want to make it up there.
Oh, and I haven't either. I mean, when I've been there, it was when it was operating, and I was there as an attorney, but yeah, and so yeah, I do hope to get up there pretty soon. So
The this is some of the experiences included haunting in cell number 48, investigating Missouri State Penitentiary with Ghost Adventures Nick Groff.
mm-hmm.
And there's a great photo. It's, if you folks are interested, it's the weekinweird.com website, and there is a snapshot in relationship to cell number 48. The inmate had been bludgeoned to death
Mm-hmm.
during the riot with a sledgehammer.
Yeah.
And the distorted image that appears in the photo is creepy.
It is creepy. And the relation of the experiences they had in the cell was rather interesting, I thought.
I did too. And additionally, just a cursory reading of all of their documentation, all of it sounded not dissimilar to a variety of things we've experienced on investigations in varying intensities.
Mm-hmm. And I guess just as a shout out segue, since Nick was involved with that one that you mentioned, if people can check out Death Walker with Nick Groff and watch the episode about the Kendrick House in Carthage, Missouri.
Yes, it's a phenomenal piece. I was so excited to see the Kendrick House featured.
Yeah,
and Nick does a great job. I
like his approach. I've known Nick a long time, and I think that he did a very good job with it. And in the episode with the penitentiary, I found the approach very similar.
Mm-hmm. And the the keys.
Yeah.
The keys at the Kendrick House. For people who are wondering, I'm not going to give it away. You need to go watch the episode. I'm actually really happy to see it finally available in the US. Because we've sort of been sitting on this reality for quite some time, months, because while it has not been available in the United States, it has been available in the UK. So you being in dialogue with Nick and knowing that it's out there, we got to see the episode separately.
Yes, but yes, it's the very good evidence caught. And if you've ever been on tour with us at the Kendrick House, you are familiar with the keys, and they play a pretty big role in the episode.
And they do. And and again, we're not going to tell you what it is. Go watch the episode. But a very important term that you use there, which is evidence caught,
mm-hmm.
where we're talking about video evidence that really has moved out of the realm of speculation.
Yes.
And thanks to technology in terms of being able to set up cameras remotely, etc., getting something that in many haunted locations, but the Ritchie Mansion comes to mind, Kendrick House come to mind for a variety of reasons for us. But so many of the reports of the hauntings in both of these locations, someone being in another room and hearing something move,
Mm-hmm.
hearing something scraping, hearing doors opening and closing, hearing footsteps, hearing activity, hearing physical interaction. But of course, as soon as somebody starts doing something, it all quits and goes away.
Right.
And you can think, oh my gosh, if I could just had a camera set up in that room, I might have been able to see what was going on. And that's exactly what we're looking at. Of course, you guys got some phenomenal captured video evidence at the Webb City Library.
Yeah.
As well, in terms of things moving on their own.
Yeah.
And which, if you're not used to this sort of thing, that is not an uncommon experience on long-term investigations. Oh, look at that. It moved on its own.
Again.
Explain that one.
That's true. And that is the advantage of being able to investigate locations over time. So
the books in the library just started moving around on their own. Must have been a weather balloon. All of my memes have been weather balloon related this week. Can't imagine why. So cell number 48 is again in talking about the physical weight, the weightiness of the room, the weight of the space. That I'm curious. I've experienced that a number of times. You walk into a space and it just feels heavy.
Feels heavy, or some other sensation. I think another sensation associated with that cell is a feeling of almost electricity, or that kind of thing. And that does happen in locations. One that comes to mind for me is actually at the Anderson House in Lexington, Missouri. And you will walk into the lower hallway, and particularly at times it's so heavy and you feel like you're in a static field, and you end up feeling like you're in a tunnel and that it's moving in a circular motion.
Mm-hmm. And from what I can tell, you and I were on a preliminary investigation recently, walking onto a raised area in an older building, and immediately heaviness, pressure, almost a sense of vertigo. We both chalked it up to a high EMF field related to just electrical equipment.
Right.
K2 meters registered almost nothing.
Yeah. No, there was no EMF there.
and a lot of people, I think, regard the EMF detectors, electromagnetic field detectors, as the gold standard of whether or not there is paranormal activity there, but that's not always the case.
No. EMF can be from a lot of different things. Even if you do have high EMF, it can be a lot of things that are not paranormal. And you can have very similar sensations to high EMF when no EMF is detected. So And those are the situations that are the most interesting, because you can't, it's trying to figure out why that sensation is going on.
Yes.
But definitely those are the kinds of sensations that often are in areas that have the highest activity. Yes.
And it is fascinating. Now, just as a continuation of this particular case with cell number 48, one of the other team members had been standing in the doorway of the cell, turned abruptly at the sound of something rushing down the catwalk toward him. Whatever it was moving quickly in enough bracket to get our attention. The invisible force entered the cell at an exceptionally fast rate, collided with the inside of my left leg, knocking me back a few paces before dissipating completely. The experience was over before I even realized what had happened. And though it has been months since the event, I'm still not able to fully explain what happened.
I've been in a number of those kinds of situations. I've had things go through me invisibly. I've watched investigators have something go into them, hit them, so to speak. That I remember one, actually at the Kendrick house, someone staying there, and it literally looking like someone had hit them in the back of the knee, and they go down on the knee real quick. I've seen investigator, pushed on his backside. And the way it happened, it really looked like someone had just tackled him.
Yeah. And this is the comparatively rare circumstances, but I do find this fascinating. There are, of course, a wide variety of ideas and misconceptions about interacting with ghosts.
Yes.
I was going to say the broad term, the paranormal, or entities, or energies, or something. I'm like, wait a second. This is Dark Ozarks. I can actually say what I'm talking about. Interacting with ghosts. And one conversation that I remember having comparatively recently has been, quote, ghosts can't actually interact with us, so why am I scared? And the experiential evidence says at times ghosts can physically interact with us.
Well, energy interacts with matter all the time in various ways, and basically that's what's happening. And I know I've experienced it. I know lots of people who have. I think people want to comfort themselves, and if I can't see it, it can't hurt me, or it can't interact with me. And that's not the case. I mean, one of the sort of funniest circumstances like that, stories like that, happened at the Opera House in Carthage. It was after the building next door had burned, and there had been water damage in the building, and so they had people in working, and they had insurance adjusters in. Owners standing there talking to insurance adjuster, and it's a rather tense conversation going back and forth, everything going on. And the owner said he felt something walk through him. And then he said the space of a couple of seconds that it would take, the rate it went through him to reach the other person, the insurance adjuster who he was talking to, he said the guy just tensed and looked around and said, "What was that?" And the owner's reaction was, "Oh, that was just a ghost. Now let's talk about this."
Yeah. it, again, I do think that how we approach a lot of these things is probably more important than what a ghost is particularly capable of at any given time.
Generally speaking, that's very true, I think.
The are there other hauntings that you've heard about, particular hauntings with the penitentiary that you think are notable at this point? I know there are many.
Yeah, down, the isolation cells, there's similar types of activity, but that area is supposed to be pretty active. In the past, where the gas chamber was supposed to be very active. The morgue, sort of almost the usual suspects when you talk about these kinds of buildings, the places that typically seem to have activity, is where you would get the most activity and stories come out of there.
And the twofold, moving over to the gas chamber at the penitentiary, around 40 inmates were executed in the gas chamber after it was installed. Of course, there's numerous hangings that took place prior to that, in the 19th and early 20th century. One, I believe, what I would consider to be a standout execution. One of, I think, only 2 women in the United States to be executed. Was one of those women was executed at the Missouri State Penitentiary. Her name was Bonnie Heddy. At one of the investigations, doing recording for EVPs, believe that they picked up the word love somewhere around in the immediate proximity of the execution chambers. And Hetty was apparently recorded as having said that she had committed the crimes for love, quote unquote.
Right.
And so there was a drawing a line between those. I wasn't involved, obviously, in that investigation. So, but it does bring up a question, which I think it's worth talking about. There are times that you record EVPs that are unmistakable.
Yes.
That there is no question but what someone is clearly speaking, saying things, and y'all with Paranormal Science Lab have captured a number of those documentedly. A lot of what we are often told as an EVP sounds like garbled white noise, that if you kind of squint and read the subtitles, you can listen to it multiple times and convince yourself that there was a word there. But if you had just played it through without any precursors, without the predictive programming to go along with it, you wouldn't have caught anything. What's your approach when it comes to deciding what is legitimate in terms of an EVP?
Well, if it's not, to be honest, probably the majority of EVPs we throw out because they aren't clear enough to be fairly certain what it says. So, and many are so soft and breathy, or there's enough white noise that you really can't with any certainty say this is what I'm hearing. And we'll have a number of people also review it independently, and then it's like everyone write down what you hear, and if everyone if everyone has something different, then and I'm not really not really feeling that one. And that's my experience when I don't watch a lot of the shows anymore, but when I do catch one, and I'll see what they are playing for EVPs, and yeah, even what makes it on TV, a lot of them, it's like, I'm not hearing that, you know. Now, occasionally they have some that you go, oh, yeah, that's real clear. That's exactly what that says, you know. But, you know, I think that people feel a pressure to put things out there no matter what. And I don't do that. I'd rather say we didn't get any good EVPs rather than put 10 out that are questionable. So
yeah. And something that I think is an important interjection, just for folks to take a step back and contemplate, is that the human mind, in order to make sense of its surroundings, seeks out recognizable patterns.
It does. And if you're in a situation that you know certain things about that location, your mind also tries to fit what it's hearing to match the location, what you think you should be hearing.
And it can be very, very difficult to objectively take yourself out of the, maintain an analysis process, but take yourself out of the equation of what the data is, or is not.
It can be, it can be easy to fall into that trap, and that's
And and coming back to this particular case, the Carl Hall and Bonnie Hetty case, I found this particular case just to be unbelievably chilling.
Yeah.
Of course, it does have it's basically connected to the entire I-70 corridor. Kansas City, Jefferson City, St. Louis. I need to just check on my puppy.
Okay.
But I was wondering if you could give folks an overview of this case, and we're really transitioning predominantly into the crime portion of the episode.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm happy to do that. Carl Hall was sort of an interesting figure. He was the son of a wealthy St. Louis lawyer. His father died in 1946 and left him more than $200,000, which was a large amount then. But Carl basically wasted it through partying and drugs, etc., and quickly had no money. So to feed his drug habit, basically at that point, he began to rob taxi cabs. And it wasn't long before they figured out who was doing it, and they arrested him. He was convicted, and he was sent to the Missouri State Prison, and was there about 16 months, released in 1953. But he still had money problems, so he was trying to figure out what to do. So he started planning the kidnapping and actual murder of a young child. It was a 6-year-old son of one of the richest men in Kansas City, Robert Greenlease. He was a 71-year-old car dealer who he and his wife had this 6-year-old boy. And so when he was released from prison, when he stepped outside, he was greeted by a woman that he never knew. And this is where it started. I mean, it's kind of a very odd circumstance how all this came about. She was a 41-year-old widow, and she embraced him and kissed him passionately, then introduced herself. And she was Bonnie Brown Hetty, and she had been an actual gun moll during the 30s. She was married to a bank robber who been in prison, and then he escaped and ended up being killed by a sheriff's posse. And so she basically had her eye on Hall, and so she takes him home, and they start planning this kidnapping.
Yes.
Yes. And it appears that no, they were planning, and they did demand a ransom of $600,000, which was a huge amount of money in the 50s. And but it appears that they planned to kill the boy from the get-go.
From the get-go. That was the most disturbing aspect of this, coupled with what they do afterwards in terms of interaction with the parents.
Yeah. Basically they through subterfuge at school, Bonnie picks the boy up, and then the school figures out the mistake has been made, and they call him home. They realize that she didn't have permission to pick him up, and so the police are called and everything. They end up shooting the boy in the head almost immediately, within hours, and taking him back to her house and burying him, and then pursue getting the ransom, which they did, and then a series of phone calls with the parents, basically keeping them on the string that the boy is alive.
Yes.
And it's, as you go through, it's just very, I mean, it's very, very callous.
It is. Of course, it's any parent's nightmare. It's no wonder that at the time that this electrified the society, really, in terms of the case.
Yes. And so, I mean, not only just almost taunting the parents with hope, but then it turns into, even more, because then when they're caught, the police turn in, police officers that catch them, they turn in part of the ransom money, and before it's all over with, 2 of the police officers are charged with stealing the money.
Yes.
And they never really recovered it. A few bills were passed, I think, in Michigan and even Canada, but they never found the money. And Hall and Hetty were convicted and sentenced to be executed at the penitentiary. And I thought another very chilling thing, while Carl was very calculating in coming up with this, Bonnie made the comment, I mean, they started coming up with different stories trying to get out of it that didn't work, but including her saying, she did it for love, that kind of thing. But when it was announced that they were getting the death sentence, she said she would rather be dead than poor.
Yes,
And that's rather chilling.
it is. It is. And of course, so many, I mean, it's very natural for parents to love their children. Obviously, what seems to really have been the case in the case of the boy, the 6-year-old who was murdered, was that his parents were incredibly dedicated to him.
Yeah.
And of course, this was in an era when it was not particularly difficult for somebody just to walk into a school and say, hey, I need to pick up so and so, and they would let them.
Right. And this was a situation, she showed up saying that I think the mother was ill, and she'd been sent to pick him up.
Yeah. It's exceptionally disturbing, exceptionally sad.
It really is. It really is. And so, I mean, whether that EVP that they discuss is her or not, who knows? But to me, it seems almost an odd thing that she would be saying from everything else.
Agreed. And they they were executed together, which I found also interesting.
I think that was making a statement.
Yeah. That they were, of course, one of our favorite criminal heroes, Pretty Boy Floyd, has a connection with Missouri State Penitentiary, as does Billy Cook.
Yes, Billy Cook was there for roughly 3 years as a teenager.
Yes. Suffered abuse, including rape, while he was there, which probably did not help the sequence of events that ended up in the spree killings. But No.
one more example of the violence at the penitentiary.
It does. And there are a number of at least anecdotal cases of individuals being what we would certainly think of as prematurely sent to the penitentiary. The idea that they had committed a crime, but not to the scope of what we would think of today as being warranted getting sent to this location.
Right. No, actually, in Billy's case, it was petty theft.
And the idea that, and I think this is a fair assessment, that many of the things that happened to him at the penitentiary led to him becoming the spree killer a few years later.
It certainly probably contributed to him going over the line, to the point of doing that. That's true. And stepping back a bit with Pretty Boy Floyd, and another connection with other events in the Ozarks with him is while he was at the penitentiary, he was there with one of the young brothers who, and they became pretty good friends. And then the young brothers were involved with the massacre at Brookline, Missouri, outside Springfield. That was the largest loss of law enforcement in a single incident up until 9/11. And of course, there's speculation that Pretty Boy Floyd was actually there at the time, and he's the one who started shooting. So,
right, as a possibility,
mm-hmm.
Which it's interesting to conjecture, regardless. And interestingly enough, we also have Emma Goldman,
Mm-hmm.
Who was definitely a lightning rod persona, and political activist, and to a certain degree, within specific circles, particularly the communist and anarchist movements of the early 20th century, she was a celebrity.
Yes. And basically she was there for political crimes, basically for trying to induce people not to register for the draft.
Yes.
And so you know, it's something that's a little different than a lot of these other cases and not what you expect. But again, just contributes to everything there, you know.
And I would say that from what seems to be apparent from her writings after being released from the Missouri State Penitentiary, her experience as a guest in the state of Missouri did not reduce her opinions of anarchy.
No, if anything, it probably solidified it. Now one prisoner that you can say is a little different kind of circumstance would be Sonny Liston.
I agree. I like Sonny.
Actually, actually something good came out of the prison in this situation.
And Sonny was born in 1930, essentially on a sharecropper farm in Arkansas. And at the time, there was no requirement of birth certificates, so they don't really know what day he was born. They're really putting it at 1930. He died on December 30th, 1970, I believe in Las Vegas, as a comparatively famous boxer. And his death is unfortunately shrouded in mystery and has some conspiracy theories attached to it.
Yeah.
And it is, to me, that it is unfortunate because the largest takeaway that I have from Sonny's history is he really was a pretty awesome guy.
He was. I mean, he had a lot of, you know, bum luck early on and ended up basically in a gang of thugs in St. Louis when he was a teenager, and he ended up getting caught, you know, with some muggings and armed robbery in 1950 when he was about 20 and ended up in prison. But it actually might have turned his life for the better, because it was there that the athletic director of the prison recognized his talent and encouraged him to start boxing. And it was actually at the prison he started learning to box. And so it ended up shaping him when he got out to become one of the greatest boxers of all time.
It did. And George Foreman described Liston as having the most natural talent and skill. Quote, George Foreman saying, quote, "There wasn't anything missing from Sonny Liston. He had the whole package." Much has been written about the effectiveness of his left jab. Others have commented favorably just on his wide range of boxing skills. And he is ranked as second in the ESPN.com's list of the hardest hitters in heavyweight history.
That's pretty impressive. So
it is. And that his boxing career started at the penitentiary.
It did. And actually someone at the prison taking notice and encouraging him. So So actually something that's a little uplifting of a story for once in these group of stories.
It is, and we also have James Earl Ray. That's not uplifting.
Yeah. Yeah. He actually escaped at one
Which
point.
did happen. I still find it impressive that anybody could.
Mm-hmm. But and of course he's most known for unfortunately assassinating Martin Luther King Jr. So
Yes, and born in Alton, grew up in Alton, Illinois.
yes, and had other connections in the southern Ozarks. So
Yeah, there's fewer than 6 degrees of separation, which sometimes can be very exciting, sometimes can be a little chilling.
mm-hmm.
And
And this
lots
is
of
one of those chilling ones.
yes, and in some cases the Bonnie Hetty case in particular, but some of these others as well. These individuals committing really, really horrific acts, but largely getting caught because the things that they did afterwards, for example, after they got their $600,000, was just ridiculously stupid.
Yeah. Yeah. Often people do themselves in that way.
Mm-hmm. And I find that particularly interesting, and more than a little both sad and terrifying. We associate the capacity to commit these acts, and in the case of this particular, the murder of the 6-year-old boy, a lot of not only audacity but a lot of moving parts, a lot of planning, a lot of process in terms of putting it all together that you ultimately associate with some sort of deep, not only deep cunning, but also a level of intelligence. And then at the same time, existing simultaneously is the fact that they're making just extraordinarily idiotic decisions in terms of trying to not get caught. And then, of course,
Overconfidence and arrogance often will do them in.
And in the case of James Earl Ray, he actually made it, to London, which I thought was impressive.
Yeah.
But continued until his death to deny his involvement, and for better or for worse, appears to have spawned a series of increasingly complex conspiracy theories surrounding the assassination.
True. And then there's a prisoner who basically has become a pop culture and blues legend.
Yeah. Who is Lee Shelton?
Yes. And one interesting thing about this is so often we talk about particularly folk songs and these folk legends, the actual beginnings are murky. Did it originate here or there or this situation or not? But in this situation, we know the facts and we know who's involved and what happened for sure.
Right. And probably in large part to the fact that there was a crime that was specifically committed, prosecuted, and resulted in this man's imprisonment in Jefferson City.
Mm-hmm. And basically, let's see, Lee Shelton was he was an African American man born in 1865 in Texas. He was working as a carriage driver in St. Louis, and where he gained a reputation as a pimp and a gambler, and was a captain in the 400 Club, which was a political and social club with a dubious reputation in the Black community. Basically, he went by the nickname Stagger Lee or Stack Lee. And there's some debate about why, but sometimes, some say it was because he went stag, they didn't have friends, that kind of thing. Sometimes it came from the name of a riverboat. But regardless, he was known as Stagger Lee or Stagley, or what later in the blues legend is known as Stagger Lee.
It is. It is. And it is a surprisingly evocative song. And as part of the folk legend, the song has there's actually a variety of different aspects of the song, or different songs.
Yeah.
That are all associated with the same legend. And the short version is Stagger Lee's honor and masculinity is insulted over a hat.
Yes.
By
Billy Lyons. Mm-hmm.
And in good old West fashion, somebody winds up dead.
Yes, and the interesting thing is they were friends, and actually, as you read through the facts of the case, it reminds me an awful lot of Wobble Hickok and Dave Tutt.
It really does.
It really does.
Although with a vastly different outcome in the court case.
Yes. Lee Shelton was not as fortunate with the crowd as Wild Bill was.
Well, and the violence that was taking place too was less of an established. Obviously, it wasn't a duel, but
right.
I'm going to be at this place at this time, and you're on your own, and more of violence that erupted into a brawl.
Yeah. It was on Christmas night of all nights, at a saloon. And
Saturnalia sacrifice.
Perhaps more literal than the pun is.
They weren't just roasting chestnuts.
No, they weren't. Billy Lyons was a levy hand, and he was shot in the stomach. And they'd been drinking together, and then they started talking about politics, and an argument was started. And we're not exactly sure the details on the argument, but it goes that Lyons snatched Shelton's hat, his Stetson hat, off of his head, which is very analogous to Dave Tutt taking Wild Bill's pocket watch as collateral for a loss in a poker game or a faro game. And he did, Shelton demanded it back. He refused. And here's where the stories diverge. Instead of then calling him out and saying, meet me on the square at such and such time, Shelton just pulled out his revolver and shot him then and there. Then he picked up his hat off of Lyon's head and walked away. But the story grew and became a folk song within a couple of years. It's first noted as being a song in 1897, and then by the 1920s, it's being recorded as a blues song.
Yes. And there's a number of bits of speculation in terms of how it arrived at that level of importance, or how it impacted the culture in that way. I think one aspect of it was this particular murder, and then consequently indictment and imprisonment, was noted in the pretty noted, was in the newspapers. There's this clear record, so it was part of public consciousness at the time. At the same time, there's various aspects of how Stackley's experiences began to speak very profoundly to a young Black male population of the turn of the 20th century.
Right, and the hat was very symbolic, and it goes back to its own form of honor culture, just as the argument with Hickok and Tutt did. But at the time, young Black men would wear a Stetson hat as basically a symbol of swagger and freedom.
Yes.
And so taking away the hat was a very emasculating
Yes.
act, and degrading.
And the hat was the Stetson, and of course various things in various cultures, but in a number of cultural demographic sects, the Stetson is iconic, and that but in different ways. They, from what we can tell, were not inexpensive. We're looking at a turn of the century price of around $25 of turn of the century currency, that in some cases you would actually make payments on your hat.
Right. Well, $25 was probably about a month's salary.
Yes.
For most people.
And that it was a sign of affluence. There was also a lot of symbolism, and there was, most importantly, I think, the symbolic attachment of adult manhood, being an emancipated free man.
Yeah.
By being able to choose and purchase this symbol, and so the degradation of the hat was also incredibly potent and emotional, and there was a lot of money involved.
That, plus this is coming from a friend too, which probably feel like a stab in the back a bit, and then refusing to give it back.
And I think that, well, coming back for just a moment, clothing in general, it's something that in our generation, we've gotten really spoiled with the idea of not only easily accessible clothing, but cheap clothing.
Right. Easily replaceable.
Very easily replaceable. And that was, not the case. It's something that I was acutely aware of as I, was purchasing wardrobe items at the Carthage battlefield in May.
Yes.
Because these handmade items in modern day 2023 currency is largely reflective of what people of that era paid for.
Yeah.
Obviously not the same numbers, but the same amount of effort coming out to put together a wardrobe, which is one of the reasons why most American settlers did not have a lot of clothes.
Exactly.
And as opposed to me, who, has a long history of finding things in the $5 rack, buying them whether I need them or not. And then I'm going, where do I put all these clothes? And the idea that that this something that we just are very accustomed to, the idea that, oh, we have plentiful clothing. Oh, I got a free t-shirt. Oh, it's a t-shirt. It's an expensive t-shirt for $20.
Yeah.
Those types of things. That was not the case. Stuff was hard to come by. And consequently, certain things had a great deal of potency in terms of what they meant within a societal structure.
Very much so. But it is interesting how the legend of the story morphed. That it took on more meaning as time went on. Instead of fading, it became more potent, and it went from this, these metaphors for manhood and freedom to then more of a supernatural bent. By the 30s, there were stories recorded of people saying that they believed, that he had been born with a caul over his face, of course, meaning that he would have sight or ability to see spirits, and or being destined for trouble. That may explain, why he was into gambling and prostitution, or even that he had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the hat. That the hat may have been magical. I mean, it just it morphs, and then the renditions of the song morph over time, and you get finally to the Nick Cave version, which basically he travels to hell and challenges the devil.
Yes. There's these layers of cultural but also folkloric and then supernatural potency that are being layered on in some cases. And I find the contextualized arguments of this particular link interesting, but saying that it is a metaphor associated with Joshua fighting the Battle of Jericho.
Yes.
And that I'm still working through that. This is from a series of articles written by James P. Hauser, associated with the symbolism of Stagger Lee. And I'd recommend, if you're not familiar with the song, look it up on YouTube. I really like the 1950s blues version the best.
Mm-hmm. I do too. But there's a number of versions, even ska versions.
I like Lloyd Price's version. The association with the song Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho, fit meaning fought, and Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. I am still attempting to put those connections together in a meaningful way.
Me too. I mean, I see his argument, but it doesn't have that feel of, I don't want to say authenticity necessarily, but it just doesn't seem to fit naturally for me. These earlier stories that were recorded about belief of his, sort of the supernatural connection, made me think more of the stories of Robert Johnson and selling his soul at the crossroads, and whether or not what was Shelton almost the prototype for that legend.
The potentiality of that idea.
That seems to make more sense to me than the other. But
the one thing that, and of course the thing that the supernatural conjecture, certainly the association then with Missouri State Penitentiary, but the fact that we are talking about culture that is, again, directly associated with St. Louis, with what is the St. Louis Metro. A lot of people don't realize that about a third of the modern day St. Louis Metro is geographically within the Ozarks. And so there are these cultural ties, and of course, Mississippi River culture, which is a big part of this as well. and Missouri River culture, not dissimilar in terms of the river boats, and all of these elements tie in to helping inform what we either know as Ozarks culture, or perhaps we don't know consciously, but these are things that have laid foundations for the development of our collective, our communal culture, whether we realize all the things feeding into it or not. I, again, mixed feelings in terms of this particular argument connecting Stagger Lee with the spiritual Joshua at the Battle of Jericho. I'm very familiar with this song as a Southern Baptist. And even though at the moment, and certainly additional information or further readings and further introspection may provide me with a different view, I'm in this unique liminal space. I find all of this incredibly fascinating, but I'm in this very unique liminal space because on one hand, I feel that the argument is at best tenuous of the connection. However, I love the argument.
I do like the argument. It just doesn't seem as natural a fit to me as some of the other aspects.
And I think, yeah, I tend to agree. I think that what is being driven at the rather than the argument itself, but I think the idea that is being driven home is that Stagger Lee, through the use of folk song, through the use of the blues, through the use of these very powerful symbols, became not just an interesting folk hero, but became a larger than life character whose the elements, perhaps not the elements of his actual life, but the elements of the poetry, the elements of the songs spoke in many different layers, in many different levels to a variety of people.
Oh, I agree with you there.
They're in the article, in this particular article, and this author's written several pieces on it, on all of this, but the hidden message in Lloyd Price's Stagger Lee, that is the article in question. And there was one reference that really jumped out to me for personal reason, and that is that the use of secret codes in African American culture of the 19th and early 20th century was not limited to music. As documented in Jacqueline Tobin's book, Hidden in Plain View, special symbols or designs were placed in quilts, which served as secret codes to runaway slaves. The quilts were hung outside of houses along the route of the Underground Railroad to indicate that the home was a safe haven for runaways working their way north to freedom. I have that book.
Yep. Oh, neat.
It jumped out to me. I love the book. I've had it since 1998 when I was at college. And it's a very, very interesting book. And I think that there is just incredible power and testament to the resiliency of the human spirit, the resiliency of the human experience associated with these elements, and this incredible connection between social statement, but not just social statement, but the pragmatism of survival and folk art, what we think of as folk art, and the fusion between those two things that I'm consistently astounded by.
It's a theme that has always fascinated me as well.
And dang it makes me want to quilt. And I'm not ashamed to say that I actually meant that. That one of these.
I just wasn't expecting that as the segue.
Well, I'm envisioning a State of the Ozarks Fest like 10 years from now that we'll have a display of quilts, and I'll be like, I made all those. You're welcome. You're welcome, community. You're welcome.
You would have to, because I would end up stabbing someone with the sewing needles before
I think that's right there. I'm not. For the record, I have yet to quilt anything, so it's anybody's guess whether that's going to happen.
I do know people we might solicit to do it for us.
Now having nightmares of getting off the plane in Helsinki and being greeted by fans expecting me to have brought a quilt.
And the audience is going, what? Anyway.
Unless they're in Helsinki. As a little bit of contextualization, we're excited, and we want to thank all of our listeners on the podcast for listening from wherever you are. And the international reach of the Dark Ozarks is growing, and we are very appreciative of that.
We really are, and we're a bit astounded at that as well, but glad that people are enjoying it. And on that quilting note, maybe we should segue into other locations.
Like Columbia, Missouri, where there are also quilts.
Most assuredly there are.
I'll get over my quilting bee here in a moment.
Well, before we jump over there, maybe we should talk about the governor's mansion briefly.
We really should. Beautiful mansion.
It is
absolutely beautiful, unmistakable as well, with its mansard rows, and it has, of course, it is the mansion in use.
Mm-hmm.
And it has an incredible history. I love that architectural style. The mansion was completed in late December of 1871, and built, interestingly enough, I thought the entire place, it was constructed in 8 months, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is for that building.
It was designed by St. Louis architect George Ingram Barnett, who was born in Nottingham, England. And I'm very interested. I'd like to check out the Henry Shaw House on the grounds of the Missouri Botanical Gardens, because both were created by the same architect.
Oh, the Shaw House is beautiful. I've been there before.
And I have been to the Botanical Gardens in St. Louis, but I was very young. So I remember it, but I can also say that architectural motifs were not something that I was paying a lot of attention to. I was very, very young. But there is a particular haunting that's actually associated with the governor's mansion.
It is, and it's also when the family involved, it is another one of those 6-degree moments in the Dark Ozarks connected to various stories. But the haunting involves the 9-year-old daughter of Governor Crittenden, she passed away in 1882 during the Christmas season, and her name was Carrie. And her father, Thomas Crittenden, played quite a role in Missouri history, not only during the Civil War, but just months before Carrie passed away, He was involved in a bit of controversy in that he put a bounty on the head of Frank and Jesse James, and he basically worked with Robert Ford to assassinate Jesse James earlier in the year, April, I believe. And then the issue came about of Frank James turning himself in, and the governor was afraid that once the assassination became known, he wondered if Frank James was going to try to kill him. And ultimately, a situation was brokered for Frank to turn himself in, and in exchange for a show trial. And that basically what they got through those events. And then just a few months later, Carrie passes away.
Yes. And the controversies regarding the James had actually resulted in threats of kidnapping in regards to Crittenden's young daughter. And so
yes,
there was a lot of sense of protection that was surrounding her, the sense of attempting to keep her safe. And by all accounts, as a 9-year-old, she was extremely popular, simply among the residents of Jefferson City. The idea that folks who had the opportunity to meet Carrie loved her.
Yes, and as a result, they said, that the air was desolation and great sorrow, and so that she really was mourned by the community, and she was buried in the Woodland or the Old City Cemetery. And then over time, her grave marker was actually lost from the ground settling and so forth. The grave was refound in the 70s.
Yes.
And then a marker put on it not that many years ago. But it appears that many people feel that she is still at the governor's mansion.
Yes, or a portion, some type of her energy, and that does seem to be the haunting. 2 other individuals were noted to have died in the mansion: Governor John Sappington Marmaduke in 1887, and First Lady Mary Dockery in 1903. So they're, but when you're dealing with notable structures that have been around for this long, these sad elements of the human story are going to take place there as well. It's simply, by de facto.
It is. But I mean, it's not necessarily a bad haunting. It seems to be playful. And I think that's why a lot of people think that it probably is Carrie, is because it seems very childlike.
Yes. And now, have you had the chance to go to the mansion? I've been by it.
I've been in it, but it's been quite a number of years ago.
You're ahead of me. I've not been in the governor's mansion. Would love to see it sometime. Downtown Jefferson City, I find just uniquely fascinating as a whole.
Yes, well, and of course it was more planned than most cities in the state as it was laid out. So, and I think that has a lot to do with it.
And from my opinion, a number of these locations downtown do have hauntings associated with them. Not
Agreed.
necessarily malevolent, but certainly definite activity.
And now we might turn to Columbia.
Something that really stuck out to me in regards to Columbia, and as a geographical primer, Columbia is outside of the Ozarks proper, on the northern
Not by
borderline.
much, but
Not by much, but it is outside. Technically, St. Charles and Alton, Illinois, are outside, but they definitely fall within that borderlands space. But something that I think is fair for individuals who are not particularly familiar with Missouri history or northern Missouri history is that Columbia and the Columbia region was a big part of the Civil War in Missouri.
yeah. Well, in the Centralia battlefield being a prime example.
It is. It's definitely we're dealing with extreme factions, and we're also dealing with a lot of natural resources. This was rich farm country, and that is easy to overlook in today's society, because we all know that food is grown in a giant distribution center for Walmart. But and in the old days, we had to grow it ourselves in farmland, and additionally, the war was run not on gasoline but on horses, and horses needed fodder. These are all became strategic key points of strategic importance for the war, and as well as things like location of the railroad, location of the telegraph wires, location of primary wagon routes in varying directions, and where troops could be could maintain for a time and not starve to death.
Very true. Yeah, foraging became a real issue in a lot of places.
And all of that and all of the violence associated with it has resulted in some really interesting anecdotal hauntings, and sometimes more than anecdotal hauntings, in the Columbia area. I think one that really jumped out is the Jewel Cemetery on South Providence Road. And this is some great resources are online at voxmagazine.com. Important that it's voxmagazine.com. It's not vox.com.
Yeah.
Important distinction. They've got some great regional articles. I'm really impressed with some of the work that they've been doing. And to me, this is a great summation of modern paranormal work. We have the Jewel Cemetery. George Jewell owned the land where the cemetery resides. It was
from in the 1700s to the 1840s, if I remember right.
Yes, and his second wife, Cynthia, is thought to haunt the area. Stories of her death vary. She may have died in 1822, giving birth to her son. Another story says that she escaped her husband and went to Mexico and took a slave with her. And then both she and the slave mysteriously died in Mexico, and her husband had their bodies brought back to Columbia. So there's a wide variety of anecdotal reports on this.
Sounds like a little bit of gossip went on.
I think mostly gossip. The story does all seem to point back to Cynthia haunting the cemetery, but Anecdotally, she also haunts the Waffle House next to the cemetery.
Well, of course, we don't know exactly what all, where the Waffle House is in relation to the property line that they own, but who knows? The Waffle House may be sitting on her favorite garden or whatever. You just don't know. Um,
I want to, I don't normally make a big deal about franchises. There's very few franchises that I actually like. But one exception is Waffle House. And I just want to go on record for saying I love Waffle House.
I do too.
And the fact that it's open, that it's just open, that really avails itself to us as investigators, because we can finish an investigation really, really late and then be like, now what? We're going to go have waffles and coffee.
Exactly.
Possibly eggs. And
haunted Waffle House at that.
Yes, I know it really is the perfect cultural storm for us to potentially do an investigation. We don't have to do an investigation and then go to Waffle House. We could just go to Waffle House and do the investigation there.
Eat through the whole investigation.
I can do that.
I know you can.
and while we're on the subject of interesting hauntings in the Columbia area, apparently the Wal-Mart on Grindstone Parkway is also haunted.
Yes, and I do find it interesting that it's particularly the toy section and that they believe a little boy haunts it, including reports of floating toys across the aisles.
Suspended hula hoops falling to the ground, hearing a child's laugh echoing through the aisles even when no children are around. I will admit that would be creepy.
You might check out the Walmart. It's an interesting haunting. A lot of times I find those kind of hauntings tend to be tied to either something that was there before or something that happened nearby, and a child spirit kind of wanders in. So it'd be interesting to know if they could figure out why the little boy's there.
It really would. And it's not unrealistic that the haunting itself may have gone back 100 plus years, 150 years.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Now, one place in Columbia that, well, a couple, we tend to have haunted colleges in Columbia.
Apparently so.
Stevens College, and Stevens College has a long reputation of being haunted.
Okay.
Yeah. I've heard those stories for a very, very long time. And of course, Stevens it's a private college, a pretty old college, and various accounts. The one that I've heard the most often is around the theater building. And I was thinking about this earlier today in reviewing, and there's a number of colleges and high schools, for that matter, that have hauntings associated with them, and a lot of them seem to be centered around the theater or auditorium.
That is interesting. What are your thoughts in regards to that?
Maybe an association of happiness or, fun in that space. Maybe some of them tend to be like Stevens, maybe related to theater students or theater directors. So having a strong emotional connection to the space and what went on there. And probably almost muscle memory, I would think, that really reminding, the space itself being a trigger.
Right. I think that's possible. Along with hotels and riverboats, theaters are almost a liminal space themselves.
Oh, I think they definitely are, in several respects, just from the, the suspension of disbelief aspect, being carried away from everyday worries, and then for the performers, it definitely is. I mean, there is a reason that they keep ghost lights lit.
Yes, there are. This great list, speaking of Columbia College and Stevens College, is from legendsofamerica.com. I was very impressed with what they put together. Columbia College was founded in 1851, Stevens College in 1833. They have, there's two legends regarding hauntings, and they're extremely similar. Of a student, a girl at the college, being involved or engaged to a Confederate soldier, and then the Confederate soldier being killed or executed, and in both cases, then saying that the girl commits suicide as the result of the death of her fiance or lover.
Yes, and I think that just goes to all of the emotions and trauma involved in the war too, that and probably that those kinds of situations happened more than we give credit to during the Civil War.
It really, to me, regardless, and you can debunk the haunting or not necessarily be able to prove the haunting, depending on your perspective. But I think to me, the more important message that's both historical and cultural is it really highlights that situation that you had Confederate and Union families, you had Confederate and Union soldiers, you had battle lines that were constantly moving, but you also had Confederates and Union identifying individuals who were in very close proximity to one another. And this type of connection, these types of connections were happening at times very tragically.
Yes. And I think it made an impression just generally on people. And then I think that's in part why you end up with these tales, whether or not the hunting is really going on or not, that they just resonate.
They do. And with the Columbia College haunting, the girl is said to have jumped from the conservatory, which is now known as Williams Hall. So if you're familiar with these locations, then guess what? Your building may be haunted. But that she had actually become engaged to this Confederate soldier and vowed to wear only gray clothing until a white wedding gown could replace it. Her fiance is killed not far from the college by Union soldiers, and the girl jumps to her death wearing her gray dress. consequently, the apparition is referred to as the Gray Lady, which
Mhm.
really jumps out to me because that's it. I'm like, okay, thank you, House of Ravenclaw. We have arrived at the Gray Lady, and I didn't even have to go to Hogwarts for it. I could just go to Columbia,
There you go.
stop at the Waffle House, and go over to Columbia College. And that I identify as the Ravenclaw house, in case anybody wonders. I took an online test once. My niece and I. She was Slytherin. I was Ravenclaw. I was very relieved to be Ravenclaw. That was a while back. And
And for official record, I have never taken one of those quizzes.
and that's a good thing.
I know what I am.
you don't need a 12-question online quiz to find out who you are.
And it doesn't have anything to do with Hogwarts.
No, exactly. Oh, what can I say? I'm an unrepentant nerd. I did like this though, because apparently sometimes the Gray Lady will open your windows if it's really hot, and possibly do your ironing.
Oh, now that's a haunting I can get into.
Same here. I can leave out never mind leaving out the cookies on Christmas Eve. I will just leave out the baskets of laundry for the Gray Lady at any time, really. I did find the haunting associated with Rockabridge Street State Park to be really interesting. There is a cave there called the Devil's Icebox Cave, and it is said to be haunted by a malevolent spirit. And there's documented over 7 miles of passages within the cave, and I don't think you can get in unless you like really register for it ahead of time. May not even then, I'm not sure, but you pretty much had me at Devil's Icebox.
Yep.
That
I mean, that piques the interest, and but yeah, I'd be interested in details of this malevolent spirit. Another interesting haunting at Stevens is with the theater, and they believe that the haunting is the founder of the theater department, Maud Adams, she had been a retired Broadway actress who retired after her mentor died, Charles Frohman. And then in 1935, the college president coached her into opening the department, and that she can still be heard in the auditorium, and also reciting Shakespeare and Chanticleer.
interesting. I like that.
I do.
That again, coming back to, well, I love the Shakespeare connection, but I also love this connection to the supernatural, essentially heightened atmosphere that can be associated with theater and performance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it makes sense to me.
it does, and it brings up something that culturally is very interesting. I think one of perhaps valid superstitions that arose around stage performance, the idea that you were tempting fate by pretending to be someone else. You go back to the fact that traditionally it was considered to be bad luck to call Macbeth by the name of the play. You called it the Scottish play.
Yes.
Invoking the actual name of the play invited bad luck. You'd go back, referencing our Christmas special, the Dark Ozarks holiday special. Welcome to Saturnalia. Going back to Saturnalia and the association with pantomime and with performance being associated with a connection with the gods and touching the divine, reaching through the metaphysical veil through performance, and the I think long-standing Anglo-Saxon superstitions that have been associated for centuries, and then you begin to see those concerns associating out of the initially strict Presbyterianism of saying, no, we're not having any plays. You can't play act. You cannot perform. You cannot do these things. And today, you're being inundated with TV and film and performance being an integral part of the educational system, etc. We look at that and we laugh and we deride those silly Puritans for being sticks in the mud and not understanding. But I think that it is important to consider how they would have been seeing these performances, particularly in terms of sort of this heightened metaphysical temptation of fate.
Yeah. I think that our perspective is so far removed now from that that it's hard to conceive that would be a concern. But when you think about it, it's kind of come full circle from more ancient times to now. And to be honest, it's venerated and to the point that just as the gods were venerated in ancient Rome. So
very much so. And sometimes we really see that on high display, which again is very interesting. I think some dynamics of the human psyche's need for the metaphysical, regardless of belief structure, are not going to be worked out of our programming.
No, I think it is hardwired, and that may be why spirits such as Maud Adams hangs around.
Right. And the muses.
Yes.
For the record, I made a fantastic Aslan once. I still have the artwork to prove it.
I have no doubt.
Became a huge fan of Narnia out of that. It's again, I love interacting, working with this aspect of the Ozarks, these northern borderland regions, and then northern Ozarks themselves. And I still contend it's some of the most evocative and beautiful country, especially in autumn. I got to spend time there again, like I said, in 2020. It was in October, and one of the neatest weeks of my life. Just seeing the countryside, seeing these places, really getting to just soak up the atmosphere. You have, of course, this incredibly rich and varied American settlement history. You have Irish immigration history. You have German settlement history. There's so much there.
It really is, but it really, I mean, it informs us in certain ways that some other areas don't, or at least in a different way. And I think it's important to when we think about these kinds of stories, as well as the geography, to be inclusive and think about how they relate to each other. And if nothing else, it just makes things a lot more interesting.
It does. It does. And of course, not only the railroads, but originally the streams of riverboats plying the Missouri.
Yeah,
Which,
right at Jeff City and right south of Columbia.
Mhm.
So much happened, and I do encourage people to, if you're in that area, check out some of these things, because it is amazing.
It is, and again, often overlooked.
It is. And that may be a good point to depart on tonight. But we do want to remind everyone to not forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for bringing the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On our next episode, we discuss how we perceive dark history and the paranormal changes with pop culture. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.